The part of this national security challenge we're facing at the moment that emanates from what I think of as the global jihad movement. You've heard the term. We're going to explain what it is, how it's operating, perhaps in ways that you haven't been exposed to before, and talk a little bit about what we can do about it. I think I've got some slides. I'm hoping they're going to show up. It's a little bit hard to see on this screen, but can we go to the first slide in my deck? What does the term jihad mean? Next slide. It is this, of course, the 9/11 attacks. It is, next slide.
That's okay. That's okay.
The Fort Hood massacre. Next slide. It is the residue of the attack that we've been talking about at Garland, Texas, the vehicle that these perps brought blown up because it was feared there was a bomb in it. Next slide. What I really want to address with you, though, is something that is less obvious and is going on under our noses, but we've largely ignored it. Next slide, please. It's called civilization jihad. It is a program of a group that I'm going to talk to you about here in a minute, but let me give you some examples of what the Muslim Brotherhood is doing to wage another kind of jihad that I think in many ways is at least as dangerous as the violent kind, and again, that we're largely ignoring. We have a book in the back called The Explanatory Memorandum. It fell into our laps, providentially. It is the secret plan of the Muslim Brotherhood for destroying Western civilization from within. I really commend it to you. Next slide. This is the mission statement of that memorandum. And by the way, this was not meant for our eyes. This was a report back to the mothership in Egypt back in 1991. Turns out they'd been at it for about 30 years, this civilization jihad. For what purpose? As I say, to eliminate and destroy Western civilization from within. By their hands, meaning ours, and the hands of the believers, so that God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. That is what the Muslim Brotherhood is up to, and frankly, it is what has spawned a whole host of other organizations, some of whom are engaged in the violent jihad, some are like these guys in participating in a more stealthy way. Next slide. Again, I don't know if you can read this very clearly or not, but here are some examples of the ways in which a stealthy, subversive kind of jihad is waged against a country like us. If you're unclear about how this is working, I'm going to show you some examples here. But if you've had any exposure at all to what's developing in Europe at the moment, you'll see these same things happening, only they're much further advanced. But we are closing up fast. Just to give you some examples, next slide. Sorry, go back just 1 second, please. I'll talk next about getting people into positions of influence, but let me just go through this list with you in case you can't read it. Trying to suppress freedom of speech. Governor Jindal was just talking about it. Believe me, when he went to Europe and talked about what he calls radical Islamic terrorism, he got a lot of pushback trying to suppress his freedom of speech. Getting into our school systems. There's a lot of talk about Common Core and what's being done to promulgate, really, a jihadist kind of Islam, indoctrinating our kids. Getting Sharia, a program I'll talk more about in a moment, into our court systems. Ann Corcoran was talking about, and I'm delighted that she was so impressive with Donald Trump, the hijra, the colonization of Muslims inside countries like ours in the non-Muslim world. Interfaith dialogue. I don't know how many of you have had your pastors or rabbis or priests engaging in this practice, but this is a particularly insidious form of civilization jihad because it basically amounts to having people of other faith run interference for these guys. And then finally, getting into the business community, really the capitalist system through something called Sharia compliant finance. We won't have time to go through all of these, but let me just give you a flavor of a couple of them in a little bit more detail. Go ahead, next slide. These are 6 folks that I profiled in a course that's available for free online at MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. The one in the upper left you may recognize. She's known as Mrs. Anthony Weiner, also as Huma Abedin, a woman who has been at the right hand of Hillary Clinton since she was First Lady, and until recently was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the State Department, and yet has extensive personal and family ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a little bit of a problem. In the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on this chap in the middle on the lower level. Next slide. His name is Mohammed Elibiari. Fellow down in Texas, Plano, Texas, has a group called the Freedom and Justice Foundation. That may sound familiar. Freedom and Justice Party happens to be the party that Mohamed Morsi ran for power in Egypt on. It's pretty clearly the case that this guy is deeply enamored of the Brotherhood. Next slide. Also, people who are taking his advice include the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, on whose advisory committee he served. Next slide. And the former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, who decided to give Mohammed Elibiari an award, the highest civilian award of the FBI for somewhat unspecified public service. But interestingly enough, next slide, where that award was given turned out to be pretty important. It was at the FBI Training Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Next slide. In that area, apparently, Mohammed Elibiari came across some documents in the training manuals of the FBI. Shortly after he was there, a fellow by the name of Spencer Ackerman, who is a really radical leftist who writes for a publication called Wired magazine, began writing a series of screeds denouncing the FBI's use of offensive materials as part of their training program. Next slide. And Mohammed Elibiari and some of his friends on the left joined forces to demand of the FBI Director Robert Mueller that those kinds of materials be purged from the FBI's training curriculum. And the people using those training materials also be removed. Next slide. Shortly thereafter, 57 groups, including a bunch of Islamists and a bunch of leftists, joined forces to say, you know what? It's not enough that the FBI not know any of this stuff. We don't want the military, we don't want the intelligence community, don't want the Department of Homeland Security to know about things like jihad and its ties to the tradition in Islam of Sharia, the doctrine that is supposed to be applied worldwide. We don't want them to know any about that. We don't want them to know that this really is authoritative Islam. Not all Muslims, but the authorities of Islam believe Sharia is the way that their faith ought to be practiced, and jihad is their obligation of the faithful Muslims. All that stuff has to go. And they wrote the then Homeland Security Advisor to the President, John Brennan. Next slide. And on the 11th of November of 2011, he agreed. So all of this material is no longer allowed to be used to train the people who are our first line of defense against things like the civilization jihad of the Muslim Brotherhood inside America. He, of course, has gone on to be the CIA director. John Brennan, next slide. This isn't the only evidence of the problematic behavior. Let me take another example also from Texas. Next slide. The Holy Land Foundation, in fact, that document that we have in the back, the explanatory memorandum, was introduced into evidence by the government in the course of this trial of these 5 co-conspirators charged with raising funds for a designated terrorist group known as Hamas. And in fact, all 5 were convicted in part on the basis of this evidence. Next slide. The guy in the far right, whose name is Mahad al-Qadir, is a particularly interesting case in point. Next slide. Because it turned out he was a particularly prodigious fundraiser for Hamas. He had a rock band and he would go out and sing songs extolling jihad. The next slide. He also happens to have been the half-brother of the guy who's the leader of Hamas. But then get this. Next slide. He also spent 8 years as a civil engineer on the payroll of the government of the city of Dallas, which prompted the then FBI special agent in charge of the Dallas office to write the mayor warning this might be a problem, because he had access to all kinds of information about the critical infrastructure of the city, which was, of course, ignored. Next slide. A couple of other examples. Anne, of course, has done a wonderful presentation on this problem of the refugee resettlement program being used as part of Al-Hijra, the colonization. I mentioned after her remarks, welcoming America, the new Americans is part of the Obama administration's current meme with respect to why people like you shouldn't get in the way of bringing more of these folks, including, I'm afraid, jihadists, into our country. Next slide. This is just one example, again, from down in Texas. It seems as though there's a lot of it going on down there, but it's true elsewhere around the country, of honor killing. These 2 young ladies were murdered by their dad because he was offended by their American dress and the fact that they were interested in dating American boys and so on. Next slide. In the school systems, this is a fellow by the name of Fethullah Gulen. Fethullah Gulen is a guy who is unfortunately now a prominent business figure. I'm not quite on the Donald Trump scale, but a multi-billion-dollar operation, including running all over the country schools known as the Gulen Movement Schools. They usually have a different brand. We had one that was being narrowly introduced in my home county of Loudoun, Virginia. But down in Texas, they've got the Harmony Schools. They've got them under other names elsewhere. And they are not specifically and explicitly promoting Sharia or their brand of Islam, but they're kind of doing it under the guise of Turkish nationalism. But fundamentally, at its core, it is a sort of Islamic supremacist doctrine, and it's being sold to Americans in charter schools, taxpayer subsidized in most cases, as science, technology, engineering, and mathematics programs, STEM programs. So keep your eye out for this kind of operation. Next slide. This is a woman by the name of Beth Van Dyne who confronted in her city of Irving, Texas, again, Texas, an effort to establish the first Islamic tribunal in the nation with the explicit purpose of having it serve as a model for the entire country. Today in Britain, there are 87 Islamic tribunals that operate side by side with English common law. Another piece of this, which her city council, in voting against this tribunal, also spoke to, is an effort to insinuate Sharia into our own court systems. We've done a study, I believe we've got copies of it in the back, in which 146 cases, and this is, by the way, just a small microcosm of the total American jurisprudence in any year, but 146 cases recently in all kinds of states across the country, I believe 32 on total, in which somebody, the plaintiff or the defendant, tried to inject into the court's proceedings the use of Sharia to decide the matter in question, usually a family law matter. In every case, of these cases, I should say, roughly 20% of the time that a judge had to rule on the matter, they ruled in favor of using Sharia. So this is happening, and it is something that a number of states are beginning to respond to, as I'll show you in a moment, and I hope the people of Iowa might take this idea as well aboard. But Beth Van Dyne is a champion, I think, of the effort to push back against this civilization jihad. Next slide. This goes to the freedom of speech point and is, I'm afraid, what we were largely hearing in the aftermath of that Garland episode was the people who warned about what's happening to our freedom of speech who were at fault, not the people who were trying to kill them. And there's a lot of that going on at the moment. Next slide. That's really part of the civilization jihad, is calling all of this Islamophobia and trying to suppress it. What do these guys all have in common? The violent jihadists and the civilization jihadists. Next slide. It's basically this doctrine of Sharia. It's this program that they believe is derived from God's will, God's direction to Muhammad and Muhammad's own practice of that program that gave rise to this thing called Sharia. Next slide. About 10% of it has something to do with religious practice by some estimates. Next slide. The other 90%, however, has to do with these kinds of things that are deeply problematic, to say the least, especially for folks like us. I'll just give you a couple of examples of how this is seen in practice. Next slide. This chap is getting off light. He's just being flogged for some probably minor offense in Saudi Arabia. Not uncommon is the amputation of various things. Next slide. Including, if you happen to be unfortunate enough to be a woman in a Sharia society, things like your nose and your ears and, well, your genitals for that matter. Next slide. But this is really the kicker. One more slide, please. The jihadists, the Sharia adherent Muslims, again, not all Muslims, but those who do follow this program, have an obligation to try to impose it worldwide, over Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And jihad, holy war, is the way to do it most efficiently. Next slide. At the end of the day, this is really about power, not about faith, which means, I think, somewhat good news, we can do something about it. Next slide. I've made this point. They're obliged to impose it through jihad. Next slide. Next slide. So, I've mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood in America. It's a 10-part course. It's available for free online. It talks in the 10th part about what we can do about these various phenomena. As individuals, as members of groups or organizations, and as citizens of our country. Next slide. So just 4 examples. Michelle Bachmann, who lost her seat, I believe, at least in part because, didn't lose her seat, decided not to run for re-election after narrowly avoiding losing her seat, when she took on the jihadists. When she raised questions in Washington, in official channels, about some of those Muslim brothers that I showed you in that slide earlier on, and whether they were having an impact on policy. Well, as one of her last official acts, she introduced legislation in the last Congress saying, you know, we ought to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as it is, as a terrorist organization. That legislation needs to be picked up and reintroduced and, I believe, adopted now. Next slide. I mentioned the courts. I mentioned the study that we've done. 9 states so far have adopted legislation that is designed to try to correct this. It is not couched in terms of Sharia, but it does, in fact, help protect against Sharia being put into our court system. It basically says, and I know this is a radical concept, American laws should be used in American courts. Most people, when you tell them that, say, duh, or incredulously ask, isn't that the way it works now? Well, it's supposed to, but it doesn't, as I've indicated in quite a number of examples. and it will increase if it's not stopped. So this law simply says no foreign law, not just Sharia, but any foreign law that violates civil rights under our Constitution and state public policy can be used in the courts of this state. We're looking for somebody to take this on in Iowa. If you know any state legislatures, where is Zach? I've been talking to him about it. Send him our way. Next slide. A ban to this free speech business. I don't know if I'll be able to show it to you, but we do have, in the next slide, a short 30-second video that tries to capture an idea as to what's going on here when people are trying to keep us from talking about this, when people are trying to tell you that what I'm saying and what others who will follow are saying is somehow Islamophobia and impermissible. Can we run that next slide, if you can bring it up? There should be at the bottom of it a bar that will actually click on the video. If not, do you see a bar down at the bottom? Is there a bar? There should be a bar with an arrow. Or maybe just click on the, there's an image there. Maybe just click on the image. Could you do that? Am I talking to you, sir? Oh, it's in the back room. Okay. Well, take my word for it. It basically makes this point. You know, you hear everywhere you go, using particularly our transportation system, if you see a package that looks suspicious, or if you see behavior that seems suspicious, what are you supposed to do? Say something. Well, basically what we're arguing is if you see any of this sort of thing going on, say something. Despite the fact that they're discouraging you from talking about it or knowing about it for that matter. So see something, say something applies here. Next slide. And I think this is my last one. Can we click forward? Securing the border, you've heard Congressman King and others talking about that. I don't think I need to belabor the point. And we need to worry this problem of legal immigration as well. And by the way, Ann focused principally on the refugee resettlement program. But there's all kinds of other facilities that are being used for this kind of legal migration as well. There's a visa lottery program. Does anybody know about the visa lottery? I mean, this is insane. But again, it goes back to Teddy Kennedy and Joe Biden, and they're like, its notion was that people have a right to be here. If they just put their name in a lottery pool and they get their card pulled, no matter who they are, no matter what their motivations may be, no matter how dangerous they could be, if they win the lottery, they get to come here and carry them out. This is crazy. What else have I got here? Well, the general thrust of this is enough already. We don't need more jihadists. We don't need more jihadist mosques. We don't need more jihadist organizations. And as we had talked about earlier in the day, we need to make sure that jihadists, among others, don't have what you might call a kill shot on the country, and protecting the grid against that possibility is also an important step against jihad. I think that's it. Anything else? Next slide. I think that's just some websites for you. I want to say thank you very much for hearing me out. This is a complex subject to some degree, but frankly, it's mostly just common sense. Once you have some sort of situational awareness, as the military says, about the nature of this enemy, what its agenda is, and the various ways in which it is advancing this jihad, where it can, through violence, because that's the preferred, that's the most efficient way to do it. But where it can't, we still need to be alive to the fact that they are pursuing this same program of bringing Sharia into societies like ours, imposing it piecemeal, steadily, stealthily, because that will advance the same objective where they're not strong enough yet, at least, to use violence. So with that, let me pause and take a couple of questions if you have any. Yes, sir. Let me get a mic over to you, sir. Stand by.
Regard to pursuing ALAC?
Mike, there you go.
Regard to pursuing ALAC here, well, there's people in this room that's been working on that, and the powers that be, the chairman of the correct committees, don't recognize that we have a trouble with it just yet. So why does this affect us? Why do we need to open that can of worms? And so we are working on it, and it has to be on more people's radar, or more things that have to get blown up first, I guess, before we're willing to be concerned over it.
Well, again, thank you for that, and I appreciate the work that's being done here. I'm unaware of it, I guess, because you haven't been able to get as far along as we all would hope. The book in the back may be helpful to you. If you haven't seen it, I commend it to you because it does show this is actually happening. It's not just off in the future. And of course, by the time things are being blown up, it's a little late to be taking this kind of prophylactic action. So I commend you for what you're doing, and those of you in this room, to the extent we can help. One of my colleagues here, Tommy Waller, is working with states across the country to help them with this kind of legislative effort. From an educational point of view, we're happy to be of assistance. Yes, sir.
In the see something, say something vein, in Fremont, Nebraska, there was a cancer physician from Pakistan who infected 99 of his patients with hepatitis C. I was wondering if you could comment on that as being part of civilization jihad.
I'm unaware of the specific example, but that kind of moves into the violent jihad, really. But it is of concern. I will share with you a story that I heard down in Texas earlier this week. A woman told me that in 1985, she had a conversation with a very well-spoken, nicely dressed, seemingly fully assimilated Muslim doctor. And the doctor shared with her in the course of a conversation, it seems unlikely, but nonetheless, this is what she said happened, that in due course, the Muslims would, wield the sword in order to force us all to submit to Sharia. This is 1985. And she said, well, why would you do that? And she said, well, that's, what we do. And she pursued it further with, well, why did you do it now? And he said, because we're not strong enough. But we will be in due course. But the other thing that I thought was interesting was that she shared with me that this particular doctor was specifically selected by the Islamic Society of Richardson, a mosque down there owned and operated by basically the Muslim Brotherhood, as Islamic societies across the country are, or Islamic centers, cultural centers they call them, are as well. And again, not all mosques and not all Muslims, but the ones that brand themselves Islamic societies or Islamic centers are generally owned and operated by the Muslim Brotherhood. When he got his credentials, this doctor, he went to the mosque and said, well, I'd like to bring to the United States some of my family members. And he was told, no, you'll use your ability to bring people to this country according to the people we tell you you can bring. So I don't know if this is directly responsive to your question, but I think doctors and people in other walks of life, civil engineers, and for that matter, scientists and so on, have a capacity to prove very problematic if they embrace this jihadist doctrine of Sharia. Yes, sir.
For those that are interested, there are quite a few things out on the computers that you can pick up about Sharia law. And recently, there have been some DVDs made that are very informational about this. One is called Unveiling the Ugly Faith. Truth. Unveiling the Ugly Truth. And there are also a couple of men who came over there with their father, who was building mosques, and these young boys converted to the Christian faith, and they're pretty interesting to hear.
Yeah. There are quite a number of people. Some of them are Muslims. A colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, is a great exemplar of people who are themselves Muslim and yet reject this Sharia program. And there are quite a number of people, as you say, who are former Muslims who have converted, who are helpful guides in what we're up against as well. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Yeah, quite by accident, a few months ago, I happened onto your report that you did in December 14, and I happen to know, since we're from Iowa and that you do things alphabetically, I looked to see what was going on in Iowa. There are 4 cases. I don't know if they're still pending or not, but I think 2 of them have to do with parental control. My question is, when I started doing some reading after that, came across something that kind of really disturbed me. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been quoted as saying that she doesn't really see anything wrong with taking the wisdom of judges in other countries. How can that be? How many of the current Supreme Court judges do you feel would bend that way? We always have 5-4 decisions, so what's going on?
Yeah, no, this is a great point. Part of what's going on, and this goes back to a question the lady asked in connection with Rick Manning's presentation on Trade Promotion Authority, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership specifically, and that is, there is within elite circles this notion that really our government isn't all that great, and a world government would be a lot better. That it would, more fairly distribute resources and address everyone's needs and, avoid war and all that stuff. And I think that some members of the Supreme Court have been encouraged, in particular because they spend a lot of time in the company with jurists in foreign lands, to believe this kind of notion. In fact, Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously said that when asked the question of, I can't remember now which country it was that was coming, to be born, and the suggestion was made, should that country be encouraged to use the U.S. Constitution as its model for a constitution going forward? And she said, well, no, I don't necessarily think it's the best model. Maybe the Constitution of South Africa would be a little bit more contemporaneous and better. So there is a lot of that going on, and I think it's probably trickling down to some other levels of the judiciary. But look, there is a long-established principle of comity, they call it, whereby you can try to accommodate foreign law where both parties agree that that's desirable. But this is what's happening now, I think, increasingly, is that you're seeing Sharia introduced in courts where one party would actually rather have their rights respected and preserved under American law. And you've got the other party saying, no, I want my law to apply. Just to give you one particularly graphic but vivid example of this, perhaps the most egregious that's come to light to date, was a judge in New Jersey who a couple of years ago was asked by a petition by a woman who was formerly from Morocco, now an American green card holder or citizen maybe, to give an injunction against her husband, a protective order against her husband, because he was systematically torturing and raping her. And the judge in the case declined to give her that protective order on the grounds that he said, I see no evidence of criminal intent. He's simply practicing what he believes are his rights under Sharia.